Good evening, everyone, or perhaps it's good morning or even good afternoon. Whatever it is and wherever you are in the world, we'd like to welcome you to coming here. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kate Pearce and I'm the publisher at Phoenix Publishing House. On behalf of Phoenix and the panel, I'd like to welcome you to our live virtual webinar, Dissociative Identity Disorder, the Hidden Condition. Just to let you know, you have a choice of how you wish to view this evening. You can either view speaker view or gallery view. The way to do this is in the top corner of your screen. And also before we begin, I would like you to take part in an anonymous poll. We're interested in understanding the makeup of our audience to make sure we deliver the best event. The button that says poll is next to the Q&A button on your screens. So if you can please click on that to answer the following 3 questions. 1, are you a mental health professional? Yes or no? 2, have you worked professionally with someone with DID? And 3, do you or a friend or family member have DID? The poll will close in 2 minutes and the results will be announced after I've handed you over to our excellent panel. So the catalyst for this event was a book we published in November of last year, The Girls Within, a true story of triumph over trauma and abuse by Gill Frost. The book details the story of Vivian, a middle-aged woman with dissociative identity disorder, which is also known as DID and is how we will mostly be referring to it tonight. The star of the book is little Vivi, an extraordinary, bright-spirited and entertaining 6-year-old who lives within Vivian. It's a wonderful book that demonstrates the realities of living with DID. It was Vivian and Gill's dream that the book would raise public awareness of DID and enable those living with it to be able to go out into the world and be trustful that they would receive kind, accepting responses. In celebration of this event, we are offering a 20% discount off the price of the paperback or the ebook, and that's till the end of July. You just need to go to our website, firingthemind.com, add the coupon code TGW20 to qualify. We'll include the details in our post-event email. It really is a wonderful book and it needed to be told, the story. So the book was the first step in raising awareness. Since then, Gill has set up her own website, gillfrost.co.uk, to provide a hub for information on DID. She's also appeared on a couple of BBC radio shows, including the Jeremy Vine show on Radio 2. And Amanda Ball, also on the panel, was alongside her. And now we have this event, which we hope will do even more to raise awareness. So when little Vivi made an appearance in Gill's therapy room, DID was not something that Gill knew about. She'd been a therapist for a couple of decades and had even lectured on psychodynamic counselling at the University of Birmingham. Yet DID was unknown to her. She had to seek out information for herself to help her client. And this situation is not uncommon. Even in the therapeutic and medical professions, DID is barely known about, and knowledge will come from vague recollections of TV shows or films on the subject. I discovered last week from another Phoenix author, Dr. Dwani Shah, that DID is the only condition in the DSM, a diagnostic manual for professionals, that is disputed. This is why this webinar is so important. We've gathered together a fantastic panel to talk to you about DID, and it's to one of the panel, Alf McFarland, who I shall now hand you over to. Thank you once again for joining us this evening, and I hope you enjoy this event. Alf, over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome everyone. Before we begin, there are a few things I need to say, housekeeping really. Firstly, just a reminder that this event is a webinar, so the only people who will appear or be audible will be members of the panel. Having said that, we very much want the event to be interactive with you, our audience, and we've left open the majority of the hour and a half to respond to questions raised and views expressed by you. So please, as you listen to contributions our 3 panelists will make by way of introduction, feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to make points you would like our panel to address. I will be keeping an eye on questions that arise and will put your points, as many as we have time for, to the panel as we go along. If your question is for a particular individual on the panel, please make that clear in what you write. And if you want to put your question anonymously, please start your question with the word anonymous. Secondly, it is possible due to the topic we're addressing that some material of a personal nature may be disclosed. We would therefore request that everyone consciously recognizes this and is mindful to respect the contribution of each person and to treat any personal material with thoughtfulness and care. Thirdly, the panelists have asked me to say that we are aware that when we speak about an issue like DID, which is a deeply personal topic for some people, the language that we use may be different to the words you use when thinking about your own experience. Some people tonight may speak of parts or of alters or of multiples. We do not intend any disrespect in the words we use, and we always want to be open to and respectful of the words other people use of themselves or of people that they know. And one final and very important bit of housekeeping is to say to anyone who has experienced trauma, but some content this evening might be triggering for you, please take whatever breaks you need and bear in mind that the recorded version of this event will be available for you to view after the event finishes. So firstly, a few words just to tell you who I am and why I'm here. Kate has already spoken to you about Gill Frost's new book, The Girls Within. This is Gill's account of a psychotherapy she conducted and which I had the great privilege of hearing about week by week as the work progressed as Gill's clinical supervisor. I'm a Jungian psychotherapist practicing in Leicester, and I do take some credit for saying to Gill towards the end of her work with Vivian that there is a remarkable story here that is worth telling. And Gill picked up that suggestion, and that ultimately led to the book. So before I introduce Gill, let's just go to the poll results. I don't quite remember whether you can see these, so I'm just going to read out what I've got here. So are you a mental health professional? 354 people, 55 people in our audience have said yes to that, and 152 said no. Have you worked professionally with someone with DID? That's 225 said yes, 283 said no. Do you or a friend or family member have DID? 117 said yes, 396 said no. Okay, so that's the poll. And thank you for participating with us in that. All right, let me introduce you first to Gill. Gill has practiced as a counselor and psychotherapist for many years. Vivian initially came to Gill with her husband because they were experiencing marital problems. And during the first months of working together, it became clear that Vivian had suffered truly awful, prolonged sexual abuse as a child. And so began many years of individual psychotherapy, during which, in time, Gill met and worked with little Vivi, who's age 6, Izzy, aged 8, and just Angry, the teenager. So Gill, perhaps would you start off the evening by telling us about your experience of working with DID and what you understand DID to be?
Right, thank you, Alf. Well, I don't want to assume that everybody who's watching and listening today understands what DID is. So for those who do know, if you can bear with me, I would just like to try and simply explain my understanding of DID. It's a little known and widely misunderstood condition, even amongst medical and therapeutic professionals. And so sadly, those with DID often experience a lack of accurate diagnosis and or effective treatment. Until 1994, DID was called multiple personality disorder, and still today, some people relate better to this outdated label. In fact, DID is a natural and complex defense mechanism that develops when young children experience overwhelming trauma that is severe and persistent. This may include extreme neglect, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, or medical trauma. When parents or caregivers are the perpetrators of terrible abuse, it means the children cannot trust them or form secure attachments. Also, because the trauma happens at a sensitive developmental stage, problems often occur with personality development. So in order to survive, these children have to dissociate, and parts of them go into the realms of unconsciousness, holding on to the overwhelmingly traumatic memories and associated emotions. Then in later years, these traumatized parts, also known as alters, make themselves known. At times, those with DID can be triggered by people or events, and they can find themselves in the grip of strong emotions and young behavior that come from their internal traumatized little ones. Others might experience switching. And switching literally means that these young parts come out. And they come out because the young parts inside will literally want to come out of hiding in such situations that the individual with DID may suddenly take on the voice, vocabulary, and mannerisms of a young child or a significantly different persona. When this happens, these internal little ones are wanting to be noticed. They have a story to tell and a great need for healing. They have been unseen and unheard for a lifetime. I've also come to know that very sadly, DID is not rare. It's due to its hiddenness that it gives the appearance of rarity. Now, how did I come to find out and know about DID? Well, it wasn't until the 1st of November 2012 that I really started to understand DID. This is the day when I was in my therapy room with my client, my middle-aged client called Vivian, that little Vivi suddenly and unexpectedly came out. The switch from adult to child happened in seconds. One moment, my adult client Vivian was talking quite coherently, and the next moment, her demeanor and her voice changed to that of a child. This little soul looked at me in surprise and said, "Hello, Jill." Quite honestly, little Vivi took my breath away. My heart started beating 19 to the dozen, and I felt completely out of my depth. My mind was racing. How was I to handle this situation? How was I to connect and work with this delightful but very, very frightened little girl? This state of shock was perhaps not surprising in light of the lack of training I'd had. Working with dissociative disorders was simply not on any core training that I'd ever had over the years, including a master's degree in psychodynamic therapy. I soon learned that I wasn't alone. Very few of my colleagues were enlightened about DID, and the same was true for the medical and mental health professionals. So who taught me most about DID? Well, that's very simple to answer. Vivian and little Vivi, first of all, taught me much. And then along came Izzy a little while later, who was the 8-year-old sister of little Vivi, and then Just Angry, who was a very bolshy teenager, but very vibrant, who was another part of Vivian's internal family. In addition, experts in the field of DID helped me enormously to understand the condition and how to work with it. Experts like Valerie Sinason, thank you, Valerie, Suzette Boone and Carolyn Spring, who offered workshops and who had written some very important books about DID. Now then, I would like to just ask you something here. It's a very important question. How do you think you would feel and react if you were to meet a young one, an alter like little Vivi? Maybe the meeting would be in a street, a shop, or in someone's home. Maybe the switching is happening to someone you know or love. Maybe it's actually happening to you and you become aware of a new and significant feeling from within yourself. If you don't know about DID or understand the condition, you might feel very shocked, like I was. You might think the person is mad, out of their mind, and want to give them a wide berth. Feeling anxious or frightened in these situations is quite understandable. But if we do have some knowledge about DID, it can change or modify our reactions. We can understand that we're actually meeting with a traumatized child who wants to be listened to, understood, accepted, and loved just as they are.
Lovely. Thank you, Jill. That's great. We are having some questions coming in. There's nothing yet that is specifically asking about the story that you've given us so far. So I'm going to leave those for now and introduce Amanda and ask Amanda to speak to us. So Amanda Ball, she, he, they lives with DID, and collectively they are known as the Eternity System. As chartered marketer and change agent, Amanda strives to make the complexities of living with DID accessible to others by sharing their everyday experiences. Amanda has had a long professional career and held senior posts in the agricultural industry. They continue to champion British food. Amanda, please, will you tell us about your experience? And perhaps you would start off by telling us about the Eternity System that I've mentioned.
Yeah, thank you very much, Al, for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. Just first off, to talk about the word system, it's a term that I've been only really familiar with. I've been aware of having dissociative identity disorder, DID, since my late 40s, which is about 3 or 4 years ago. And so all of the terminology that we spoke a bit about earlier in the introduction, you know, can be quite daunting, certainly when you first realize that you know, DID is something that you're living with. And really the only people that I learned some of the sort of language to help describe the experiences that I was having was mainly from the community myself, and then later on through my therapist when I was working with Jill. A couple of other things to say is that I'm not the person that the book is written about, just in case any of you are wondering. And the other thing it's really important for me to say on behalf of those people that that live with dissociative identity disorder or other specified dissociative disorders is that I'm talking about my experiences, and it's really important to note that experiences do vary. And even the sort of thing that Jill was talking about earlier with, in the main, people will have child alters, child parts, but there will be some people with DID that have older parts. They may have bought into themselves, introjected, if you like, a sort of caregiving figure into their mind, and they may well have older parts. And generally speaking, though, parts of ourselves play different roles. They might also represent different age stages in our life, which tends to be, but not always, in line with when significant trauma occurred. So for me, you're listening this evening to Amanda. I'm one of 8. So there are 8 of us in my internal family system. And I tend to use the word system rather than using our surname to describe us in plural, and you'll work out why that is when you remind yourself of what my surname is. So we are collectively known as the Eternity System. And I have younger parts of me. I have one male who goes without describing what his age is, I think probably so that he can appear to the outside world as very definitely grown up. But how I experience those other parts of me are pretty much as younger parts. So they range from a pre-verbal, so an infant, up to myself in my early 50s, but most of us are teens and tweens and infants and toddlers. It probably, perhaps I'll go on now to talk a little bit about when I kind of first started experiencing my symptoms.
Yes, although let me just put one question to you from someone who's asked a question to you. Did you choose the name Eternity for your system? And if so, why choose Eternity from Jan?
Yeah. So Eternity is quite connected to the infinity symbol. So eternal love and infinity. So there's a sort of symbolic representation of love and interconnectedness with the infinity system. But also my previous therapist, who's with us this evening, is now retired, happened to wear that perfume. So it was a very personal thing as well. So yeah, but it wasn't something that came to us initially. And certainly I know some people with DID wonder whether they should or they shouldn't have a system name. And everybody is different. And whether people choose to or don't choose to, that's valid.
Thanks, Amanda. You go ahead. You're going to tell us a bit
Yeah,
more.
so some people with DID, when they look back, or even maybe in their early years, may begin to experience and feel other parts of themselves, and actually don't even know that that's not the way that everyone else experiences life, until perhaps they get a little bit older and start wondering why, and perhaps realizing their experience is a bit different. For me, I wasn't aware until I was in my late 40s. And I now know that that was predominantly due to what we call dissociative barriers. So essentially my coping strategy, which was generally busyness and working, kept the early trauma away from my consciousness. But I did always know that I had significant amnesia for my past. And I also knew that I rarely experienced emotions in the way that I observed other people. And then that all changed in my late 40s. Looking back, it was probably a time of crisis in the industry I was working with and a period of significant stress. But ordinarily, I would have coped with that, and it would have just been water off a duck's back. But I think there are a number of things that sort of formed a catalyst. And I started experiencing what I now know as a range of dissociative symptoms. So started to sense that the world didn't quite feel right around me. I felt a little odd. I felt a bit sort of I didn't quite feel in my body. But then one day in particular that I do remember, I started hearing the voice of a child crying inside my head. And that's when I was already in therapy at that point, but it was luckily for me that the temporary therapist I was working with, I went to essentially in an emergency, did ask me if I was aware of the fact that I was dissociating. And perhaps as we go through the evening, we can describe a little bit more about how dissociation can present.
Lovely.
I think I'll pause there because I'm sure there'll be plenty more to come and
Great, lovely.
take a chance for others.
Perhaps I could put a question to you here from Mary Conroy. What effects does society have on you? Do you feel you have to defend yourself?
Yes, I do, in the sense of I do have to find that, as Gill was saying, that I need to go through an awful lot of explanation about the mental health condition that I'm living with because of the lack of awareness. And therefore then that feels like a defense almost, because it's not something that people are automatically familiar with. I have had some experiences of not being believed, and that again can be quite common, particularly for some people, ironically, that aren't necessarily very overt with their symptoms. So, the title of this talk this evening is about a hidden condition, and that goes in more ways than one. So some parts are able to mask the, another part and appear to the outside world. We can't do that as it happens, but so yeah, I have experienced almost disbelief, and that may just be an appropriate time to think as well that you might all be thinking, how can a woman like this sitting here, hopefully sounding reasonably sort of sensible to you and able to explain myself reasonably well, how on earth could I be living with sort of quite a severe, what I experience as quite a severe condition? And that is because I have DID. Mm-hmm. So I am able to separate off, to dissociate, to to a certain degree, control at times, the emotional side of myself. And so it's thanks to the other parts of me that I'm able to do things like this evening.
Lovely. Yes, thank you, Amanda. That's enlightening. Thank you for that. Now, look, there are lots of questions coming in here, and I will do my best to get through them, but I'm sure I won't get through them all. But I do want to now introduce you to Valerie, and some of these questions I'm sure Valerie will be the best person to address for us. Valerie is a child psychotherapist and adult psychoanalyst, and has many, many years of working with people who live with DID. She's published widely many books and papers in this area. So Valerie, perhaps would you begin by thinking about that question of why is DID not widely acknowledged among mental health professionals?
Hello everybody, and that really is such an important and awful question, because there's got to be very powerful reasons for the lack of education around this. And I have got some thoughts around it. One, I think it's because DID is the result of a crime. And apologies to anyone I'm triggering by saying that. Whether it was deliberate or unintentional, a crime has happened against a child for the child to need that defense. And people that are used to working with victims don't want to think that there might be a perpetrator about, because that puts them in a legal situation and they get frightened. Secondly, you don't get DID without another double whammy that you've already had a disorganized attachment from birth. In other words, whether intentional or unintentional, a key attachment figure is either frightened or frightening, which makes the baby and child vulnerable to a dissociative disorder if trauma follows. And we need to know that 90% of adults with DID disclose abuse under the age of 6. Thirdly, I think in the West we have this stiff upper lip insecure attachment in which we think there's such a thing as an ego, rather than, as John Southgate, the founder of the Bowlby Centre, said, we're all multiple. If we're lucky, we are associating multiples. If we're not, we're dissociating. But we are all multiple, but that threatens the sense of self some people want to hold on to. Fourthly, the actual trauma is not bearable for people to listen to. This is a familiar response to trauma. People can't manage it. And finally, if we're not taught it when we're training, we don't know it exists. And that feels the biggest waste, that really caring professionals that will be shocked, like Gill and I were when we realised this, would be shocked that we weren't taught it, because we've let people down horribly. So that's why this book and this webinar is so important. I don't know if you wanted me to say a couple of words about some of the questions, Alf.
Yes, are you able to view these? Great. Yes, go for it. Yes, please.
For example, child personalities and questions. Do they get older? Do they change? This varies person to person. All of us are unique. The fact that several people might have a condition with the same name doesn't mean any system is like any other. So there are some where a child will grow to the biological age of the body, and others where that will never happen, and some where the whole system want that to happen, but it doesn't, and some where they don't want it to happen, but it does, and we do not know. So we have to be very humble. People struggling on their own with no therapy. Since most professionals have been so lousy, often through no fault of their own, it's not in their training, just finding one volunteer line like rape crisis, and educating the person at the other end of the phone with who you are can make a huge difference. Writing a diary, having one friend, one neighbor, one person. And I do know some amazing people that have done it all themselves through going to webinars, reading, and looking after themselves. So it's not always a help if you go for treatment and someone doesn't believe you, or like some people I met when they were in hospital and got a kind of comment like, I'm only going to talk to you by your biological name, or it's collusion with a delusion. You're no good being in hospital if you're getting an attitude like that. So do not underestimate yourselves and what you can do there. The question about dissociative disorders otherwise specified, there's a real issue as to whether and when a diagnosis is helpful. If you've met a relational therapist that cares about knowing you, it's irrelevant which your diagnosis is, because you and them will be learning to meet each other. And it's not very scientific. Many times somebody might come out from one assessment with no amnesia. After 2 years in therapy, the amnesia might be found from someone you never even knew existed at the start. So don't worry about the diagnosis. Worry about whether you're lucky enough to meet someone that cares to relate to you and won't go all defensive on you.
Yes, lovely. Thank you, Valerie. I think that's a fundamental point for all of us, that a respect for the person who comes to you and an acceptance of the person who comes and an openness to whatever that person brings. That's absolutely the starting point, isn't it, for working with anyone, but particularly people with DID. Gill, someone has asked a question here about how Vivian feels about the book that you've written, which I think would be good to respond to.
Right, thank you. How does she feel about it? Well, the extraordinary thing is that although she read the manuscript before I put it forward to see whether it could be published, and she sort of read little chunks of it, since it's been in book form, she hasn't been able to bring herself to read it from cover to cover. But she does keep it at home, and it's for her a vehicle by which she has been able to help other people in her situation. And I think that it's very understandable that Vivian has needed to keep her identity under wraps for very important reasons. And unlike Amanda, doesn't have the capacity or the situation that enables her to make herself known. But she has such a heart for the fact that her story might inspire, her story might make a change to other people, that it might encourage therapists to go and get trained specifically to be able to work with DID. So Vivian herself was hugely enthusiastic and supportive. And of course, the other thing that was wonderful was that Vivian and I had agreed that I would write this book and she would read it bit by bit and check that what I was writing was okay with her. And then I'd been writing for about 6 months, excuse me. And I said, Vivian, do you realize we've had this huge oversight? And she said, what's that? I said, but we haven't asked little Vivi if she's okay with it, because at that time she was the only part that we were working with. So she said, oh my gosh. So the next time little Vivi came out, I said, now then, little Vivi, I've got something really, really important to ask you. I said, what would you think if I said I was writing a book? And she said, oh, that sounds interesting. And I said, and how would you feel if I told you that the book was about you? And she went, about me? Oh my gosh. And she sort of got up, did a little dance and sat down again. And she said, I'd love it. And so at the very end of writing the book, we did have a verbal agreement from little Vivi and from Izzy and from all the other parts that they were absolutely okay with it. And so too, obviously, did Vivian herself have to write to say that she was in agreement with, with the book being published. So yeah, all parts were absolutely a-okay with it.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks. Amanda, here's one addressed to you from an anonymous attendee. Did or do any of the parts disbelieve that there was a trauma and believe that it's made up, that it's fiction? Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, I was actually looking at Jill's screen to see whether she'd muted, and I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you. Yes. I'm sorry, Alf. Could you just repeat the question for me?
Yes. Do any of the parts disbelieve that you experienced a trauma?
Yeah. So, and again, this will vary with different people with DID, but there will be a trauma that we've experienced that we're still not yet aware of, for sure. Or we're not aware of the details. We might have fragments of memories, we might have associations and just know that things weren't right, or certain types of triggers. And so therefore, it's not necessarily always disbelief, it's the fact that it may not yet have come into our consciousness because our mind isn't yet ready to release it, or I should say, that if trauma's happened at a very young age, then there isn't what we would all think of as a narrative to accompany that memory. So a young part might not be able to put it into language. It might just manifest by way of, now what we know from science and from esteemed writers and so on, as trauma held within the body. We do also really struggle with the prospect of knowing that either intentionally or unintentionally we experienced trauma in our younger years. And that's often, I think, not just for myself, but for other people, where you also hold the people in mind that were around you when you were growing up in positive regard as well. And so sometimes it's quite difficult, particularly for younger parts and with people with DID, to hold a sort of awareness of two possibilities, that positive things may have happened and potentially bad things may have happened. So it's not so much that we don't believe it, it's more a case of whether we're ready to process and acknowledge it, whether or not it's yet come into our consciousness. And also, very importantly, when we think about the word trigger, which has become sort of quite hijacked in terms of modern parlance to really mean anything that other people do that actually is distasteful to us. But in a trauma sense, it's actually a very significant word, and is an experience that can be very, very frightening and debilitating. But sometimes triggers are positive things because they signpost to unhealed trauma or things that have happened that we are not yet aware of. And that's happened to me, it happens almost daily actually, but it's happened quite a long way. So I've got this great big long list of why do we get troubled by X, Y, or Z? And we don't yet know, and we may not ever know.
Right, lovely. Yes, thank you. Valerie, I wondered if you wanted to come in with a thought there, or shall I move on to another question?
Just to agree with Amanda that everybody's got a different time where it's right to process. And please know, you don't have to remember everything. In fact, I hope you don't when it's lousy. Why should the abusers have the pleasure of you carrying on being hurt? So that there are in some systems, there are some children that will hold on to the trauma out of love for the rest of the system, because even though they're little, they were the age that managed it and know how to deal with it better than the others. So there isn't a right or wrong. That's really important. And there isn't a right kind of therapy. As Gill has pointed out, she's used the most wonderful mixture. She's brought in energy therapy, she's brought in analytic thinking, and I don't know any therapist that has stayed totally within one frame, because you need everything inside you that works. And I think Gill, as a former teacher, I think that bit of her has really helped as well. So if there is somebody around that you trust, don't worry what the type of therapy is. So it's much more getting a match with the person.
Lovely. Yes, thank you. Thank you. I wonder if you would address boundaries in working with someone with DID. But Gill and I thought long and hard together through the course of this work, and I'm sure it's something which you're familiar with too, Valerie.
When Gill first approached me several years ago to tell me that she found there were certain boundaries that didn't feel right at a certain time with her patients, and I burst out laughing and said, join the club, because I don't feel this is 9 to 5 work. And I know lots of people will be worried by me saying that, but I see it much more as a boundary being a breathing, flexible issue. You don't want to be run ragged by doing more than you can manage. And one of the impressive things in the book, which is Gill and you over how you put that together, was working out when you could tighten the hours in which you worked because they could manage it, and when you couldn't. And sometimes we don't get it right. But I would rather make a mistake in going out of hours than having a neutrality that ends up being dissociative. So in fact, I do not know therapists that have managed a total usual structure unless they've got someone else doing support, or where there's a very good friend, partner, volunteer, support worker, nurse. Because if someone has been hurt right through their earliest years, they could really deserve daytime, nighttime attachment figures there for them for the rest of their lives. And what do they get in many NHS places? 1 year of once a week something. Yes. When this needs long-term work, and that needs to be fought for. You don't call people on a dialysis machine addicts. And there's a way people giving long-term therapy are treated. Aren't you making them dependent? You don't say that about a dialysis machine. Yeah. So this needs all of us fighting. This is long-term work, and we need to be respectful of the different capacities within the system and within ourselves.
You've addressed something really, I think, important and powerful within the culture in the country, but also within the culture within the NHS, a kind of attack on dependence in the mental health field, a kind of denial that, of course, people who are very ill need a lot of care, and there's a lot of fear and a lot of, I think too, fear of the amount of need that there is, and so people are not given the care they need.
Yes. Yeah. But the beauty of webinars, books, survivor groups is the more society is accepting, that reduces the shame and unwarranted social burdens created, so that people can make better use of whatever time they're given. But when they've got society on their back as well, that's just a horrendous burden.
Having support is a really key part of both, I think, both living with DID and also work. I mean, Gill and I we worked together we met once a week throughout the whole of this work, and I think, Gill, it was important that we were able to give that amount of care and thought for you working with Vivian as we went along.
Absolutely. I mean, I was at one point having supervision from you, Alf, for the clinical work, for the very important job of thinking about the situation, thinking about what was going on in the process from a sort of psychotherapeutic point of view. But I was also every week having supervision from my energy therapist supervisor, and I was having more supervision than I was doing anything else really. But without that support, without another pair of eyes watching, another pair of ears listening to what I was saying and what was going on, I really don't think that the story would have quite ended as it did, because I needed the support, and I felt very much, Alf, your sense of arms around me, supporting me, and my energy therapist supervisor doing the same. And because there were so many times when I wasn't sure what I was doing. It was all so frighteningly new. It was also overwhelmingly emotional at times. And to be able to continue as a therapist, seeing many, many, many other clients at the same time, it's a sort of, you do need this support in the same way, Valerie, as you've so succinctly and beautifully put it, that all these clients who've got DID, they need so much more support. They almost need that sort of mother figure who can be there to be called upon 24 hours a day, because that's what they've been missing. So both the therapist and the person being therapized, they both need their own support for it to work. And I'm so grateful to you, Alf, and to Michelle, my energy therapist supervisor, for what you gave me, because I couldn't have done it on my own, I don't think.
Yes, I think it's an important one, because it is also the case that we know from research that it is often with patients who have been sexually abused, who've been horribly abused as children, where therapists can get pulled into, because of the demand and the desire in the therapist to meet the demand, that the therapist can get into trouble and actually act out very destructively, very damagingly with their patients. So again, not taking on this work in a heroic way, recognizing the demands and making sure that as the therapist, you are having the help to think about the challenges that you meet. Let's go back to some questions here. One here, Amanda, for you. I think it's Jenya. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce the name. How has DID affected your relationships, Amanda?
Significantly, it's affected my relationship with myself and now myself. So, to start with, the real big task really was getting to know myself, and to begin with, I was only aware of 2 other parts of me, and then over the last period of the last 4 years, we've got to know the rest of me. However, so I'll talk about that relationship with my internal family first, in that not each part is aware or what we call in DID language as co-conscious. In other words, able to communicate and experience other parts of me. So in my situation, if I switch, then essentially I go, out back, so to speak. And so there's the relationship with myself and selves, because to start with, my predominant identity was a work self, obviously a wife, a sister, and so on. So to start with, it was about me trying to get to grips with that's a daily struggle. I really don't know who I am, because most of my experiences and emotions are held in other parts of me. So I don't ever get a continuum. I never really have this sense of my whole day or my whole life, because even if adult Amanda stays present for most of the day, you know, I might have thought intrusion or other things going on. As far as relationships with friends and family, yeah, I mean, I now represent something very different to them than I did when I was that working, organized organizer, you know, relatively sociable and in a work sense, very definitely outgoing. And now I'm much more vulnerable. And that takes, particularly people that have known you for a very long time, that takes some getting used to. And for some people, they've stepped away. And also I've had to learn a hard lesson about my career identity and myself, in that I was in an industry for sort of 34, 35 years, and now sadly are in very, very limited contact with a lot of those people who I probably held very dearly as my work family. So my network of contacts is much, much smaller. I've now been learning, getting used to a new family, which is a DID community externally, my internal family, and anyone who chooses to support me within my daily life. Can I just come back just briefly about as well about the point about boundaries, and also about NHS? We're obviously on a webinar here that could be held could be heard globally. So I am conscious that it's, you know, not just our National Health Service, but in terms of the provision of therapeutic support globally, this is an issue. How it's funded obviously varies within country, but how it's resourced is pretty much quite consistent worldwide from what I see, in that you know, that it is lacking. And the other thing about boundaries is that of course it's always a conflict for people like myself, because my adult self wants my therapist to be healthy, to have her own time, to have her own space. But I can't say how important enough it is for all of, particularly people with, you know, a lot of younger parts, just to know that you're held in mind. And so it isn't necessarily always about being completely available. It's about being known that you're held in mind. And people with DID often have what's called lack of object permanence, in that we can't sense the love and the feeling from other people unless we can physically see them and be with them. So separation anxiety is a huge issue, as you know, therapists that work in the field will know. And boundaries just need constantly discussing and being open, as do relationship boundaries, you know, as the person who asked the question.
Yes.
So yeah, but support around you in whatever shape or form one can get it is critical, because the therapist, much as I would like them to be, isn't there 24/7.
Yes, yes. Okay, lovely.
Thanks for that question.
Gill, go ahead.
It would help if I turned my mute button off, wouldn't it? I just really quickly wanted to come in there and endorse what Amanda's saying, because I think if the truth be known, one of the very, very important reasons why Vivian achieved the most extraordinarily successful outcome to her very long but fascinating, hard-working experience of therapy was because her family, that's her husband and 4 children, was so amazingly, consistently supportive, loving, accepting of each and every one of the parts. And I cannot express what a difference that must have made to her. And well, I mean, I have just some very, very warm and quite emotional memories of Marcus driving Vivian to therapy twice a week, and either sitting in the car during the therapy session and then driving her home again, usually in the shape of little Vivi, because when little Vivi came out in the session, she never wanted to go back inside because she liked to be out there, you know, enjoying the outside world. And so there would Marcus be waiting in the car park twice a week, usually, waiting for little Vivi to come out and say, hello, Marcus, and get into the car and drive off, and she'd be waving to you, bye, Jill, see you next time. And that devotion and that support, along with the support from her children, is absolutely priceless, absolutely priceless. And so, you know, it's absolutely what you're saying, Amanda, that I think that Vivian was and still is extremely fortunate to have the family, you know, husband and children as she does, because it's not everybody's privilege to have that.
Lovely, yes, thank you. Question here, Amanda, for you too, again, from Christine. Do you know when you are about to dissociate, or can it happen all of a sudden? And are there ways of coping with that?
Yeah, so again, this will vary person by person, but I probably have an unhelpful ability to suppress. Therefore, there are probably times when it would be more helpful for me to show and to allow dissociation to happen. If we just, for anybody who doesn't quite understand what we mean by dissociation, because it tends to be viewed purely in a one-dimensional zoning out when we talk about dissociation, but essentially, you know, dissociation, whether we're talking about separation from or unconnected with, be that ourselves, our body, our memories, our identity, the world around us. It's a sort of separation or a detachment from, and dissociation can come in lots of different forms. But if we think now about the process of switching, so for example, if I'm starting to listen to the conversation this evening and I sense a feeling that, you know, something that Valerie was saying earlier, and I can feel, like many people can, that sort of sense of, wow, you know, that pulled at my heartstrings, or that touched me in some way, then in order for me to experience that emotion, I would have to switch, because adult Amanda here, the person you're speaking to, you, that's part of my disorder. I would get overwhelmed. I never used to feel anything prior to having my symptoms. I was pretty much numb. And now if I experience emotion, I would switch. So yes, I do sometimes get, now that I'm able to tune into my body. Before I didn't. It was almost sort of, you know, what's going on down here then? Now I've learned through therapy and with support and a lot of hard work to actually tune into my body. So I now start to sense when there's another part of me that is feeling either it has a view or has an emotion or a sensation about what's happening around me. So therefore I can control it, which is why I'm able still to sit here this evening. And if I was to sort of switch at free will, then with some of the stuff that's already been talked about, other parts will be sat here talking to you now. If I'm triggered by something that reminds us of early trauma, either things that we may have had previous memory recoveries from, or that we may not up until now be aware of, sometimes it can literally be a split second and I'm gone. So it varies. And also, once you get to know that something is a trigger, then that's where the early stages of therapy, which is called stabilization, and, you know, learning how to ground and how to tune in and understand what your triggers are, then there are times when actually it might be helpful to allow that process of switching and dissociative behavior to happen. And there are other times when, you know, it may not be safe to do so, but I haven't always got control over that. Depends on how badly I'm triggered. Right. And that could be a positive trigger. It could be if somebody decided to put a favorite piece of music on now that one of my parts loves, then I would be struggling to sort of stay sat in my chair. So it can be positive triggers as well as negative triggers, because it might be a characteristic that another part of me tunes into.
Lovely, thank you, thank you. Valerie, perhaps you would address this one. How to deal, this is from an anonymous attendee, how to deal when the perpetrator is internalized and there are pedophilic thoughts in a part of the person due to child sexual abuse.
What a very important question, because this is a very key issue in work with people that have sustained certain kinds of long-term abuse. All of us identify with the people that bring us up. When they're good people, we take the credit for what in us is good. When they're not, we're wanting to assume that no one will be affected. But someone with abusing parents that they love, of course, will have to accommodate that behaviour and have parts that identify with it and reproduce it. And they also help to keep the person alive. This can be hard for therapists that only were concerned with victims and didn't realise that all humans are victim perpetrators. We're just lucky of how much is one bit on the spectrum versus another. But if you take for granted that there but for the grace of God go I, then no one has got abusive thoughts to children out of a happy childhood. So you work with that and you help someone understand that to love a parent that never got treated, you need to find a way of accepting their disturbance without feeling you have to be them. And I think that's the most important part of long-term work. Increasingly, we're finding that perpetrator outers, or whatever they want to call themselves, and people have sort of brought up issues about language, which is very important. Whatever language they choose, they are as important and valuable as everyone else in the system, and in fact they're even more vulnerable because they survived and helped everyone else survive by being part of it. And we're finding that this comes out a lot later. Many are too ashamed to come out, or come out only in rages or injuring the parts that they see as being disloyal or putting the family, outside family, in danger. And a lot of papers have been written about this in the last few years. I think people will be very helped. It does matter, people know they will be getting links to books, organisations, places they can phone. But perpetrator introjects is the rather ugly academic term that's been largely used. And I would say practically I've met hundreds, and they are the bravest people you can meet. And most of them, when they are valued and given space, are bravely able to face exactly how failing their families were. In the few situations where somebody can't change because the shame at realizing how they've been betrayed is so huge, it matters helping the rest of the system to hold that part so that action doesn't follow.
Lovely, thank you. I wonder if you would just address too the question about therapists, professionals working with someone who discloses an internal perpetrator. There's such anxiety about safeguarding that's appropriate, but real care needed in this area, not to inappropriately sort of go to safeguarding when this is an internal part that's coming into awareness and needing to be understood and cared for.
And there are times where working independently is a lot nicer than in a team, in terms of having the freedom with supervision to work out the balance of risk. Men with DID who feel frightened of how aggressive or abusive their perpetrator parts can be will often, out of a self-sacrifice, get themselves into prison. There is a gender divide, And it's worth saying that with most people I've met, there's been all ages, all genders, all sexualities. So be prepared for any mixture. No two people are the same, but there does seem to be a difference in terms of the group that end up putting themselves into prison almost. It matters not to rush into fearful safeguarding, but to weigh up carefully, to honestly let somebody know the situation in which you would have to report to somebody, so that there's no betrayal or lying.
Yes.
And I had the benefit of a wonderful police officer, in fact, the guy that solved the Stephen Lawrence case and the only honour killing case that was solved in the country, Clive Driscoll, where we could get him to talk to people that were scared about what they might do, so he could tell them the sort of things that would happen if that part of them wasn't helped to rein in those understandable feelings after what they'd gone through.
Thank you. That's tremendous support that you had there from the police. That's great to hear. Sam Zupardi here asking Valerie, have I understood right that an insecure attachment is a prerequisite for DID if followed by trauma? Does it ever not arise from an initial background of insecure attachment?
There's got to be some outlier. To say something is 100% is always risky, but the current research, however stable that is that a disorganized attachment, which is the most difficult version of insecure attachment, is there first. So it might not be parents that have abused a child, it can be neighbor, teacher, friend, sibling. But if there isn't that disorganized attachment there, sometimes you find people that wish they did have DID because they remember everything, and they wish they didn't because it's so unbearable. So within the kinds of insecure attachment, disorganized attachment is a separate category, and Brett Carr, Adar Sachs and I felt within that there's an even more painful one called infanticidal attachment. And this is where a child faces an actual carried out death wish by its attachment figures, where there's near-death experiences, because how you have to deal with that and how that affects your attachment to your therapist and anybody is a huge issue. So I have not heard of DID coming without a difficult attachment pattern to begin with. But of course, a baby is totally dissociative. What we slowly grow is a management system that sees all the different parts of us. So the idea that somebody was solid and then trauma breaks them into pieces, it's not that. It's that the pieces we're all in anyway carry on being separate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks. Maybe just address too there's a couple of people have asked a question around whether sexual abuse is always, I know you've said there's never 100% about anything, but that the sexual abuse is always a feature of DID.
It was 90% of adults with DID reported this. I have seen DID that came from a mother with postnatal depression who could not bear the sight of the baby that reminded her of her own self-hatred and couldn't love the baby, and where the level of that led to dissociation. Also where there's a breakdown in a parent, or where an attachment figure is going through hell of their own kind and can't look after their child. So it's not every time, but that has been the largest in the research to date.
And the gender split, do you have a sense of a gender split with people who live with DID?
That the majority of DID that we know about is females, but we do not know how many men with DID might be in prison or psychiatric hospitals where the DID was hidden in other actions.
Yes, okay. All right, I'm just looking at other questions here. If Amanda and Gill, if you have spotted a question that you want to address, please do go ahead. I'm just looking at questions here. This is from an anonymous attendee. Is it good practice for therapists with DID to disclose to clients when seen as helpful?
Sorry, Alf, could you just repeat that? I was scrolling the questions, which probably
Yes,
isn't helpful actually.
Yes, I think we're all.
So I won't do that.
Could
you pose that again?
Yes.
Sorry.
Someone asking, is it good practice for a therapist who has DID to disclose to a client when that's seen as a helpful thing to do?
I'll just come in from a client perspective, really, in terms of disclosure. And then maybe Valerie or Gill can talk about the sort of more the perspective of governing bodies and accredited bodies and so on, and what their view might be on disclosure. But I think if a therapist disclosed to me that they had DID in the early stages, I personally don't think I would feel held. I don't think I would feel safe and secure, because our system would always worries about others. So I think we would constantly be worrying that we were going to upset or trigger the therapist. Disclosure, however, I have seen documentaries with therapists who do have DID that have been through their own healing journey, have their own support, and that wouldn't faze me. Someone that has had support and declares that they've had a dissociative disorder and maybe now are sort of more along the lines of functional multiplicity. In other words, they're managing their daily life without their symptoms severely impacting on their daily life. The aspect of disclosure, be that something that a therapist is going through in their private life, there are sometimes, in terms of boundaries, that some therapists or others might think is unconventional. And that's really because people with DID are hypervigilant in the main, and we will pick up on tiny little things. I would be able to sense when my therapist has maybe not slept very well, whether there was just a slight difference in her level of attunement with me. And Jill's smiling now, having experienced that firsthand, and my now current therapist does. So conscious of the time, I'm sure there's lots of questions, but so from my perspective, I would feel it would only be helpful at the point that the therapist had enough therapy and enough support as her or himself.
Yes, thank you. Yes. A question from Claire Stoko. This is about finding a therapist, Valerie. So your resources will be helpful here. What would you advise us to find a good therapist that will not invalidate us? Claire is having a not a good experience with NHS therapy. How can she find a therapist who will accept her as she is?
Well, at this moment, with people operating by Zoom, I've met people who found a therapist from another country that they would never have had an option of before. So that there is trying on websites dealing with this subject. There is going to organisations like the Bowlby Centre, the Clinic for Dissociative Studies, where they do focus on DID. But I think we've got a political task, which I try every few years and have given up for a while, but that this webinar should get us doing again, which is writing to all the major therapy organizations to say this is unethical and against human rights, that it is disability discrimination, that everybody has to be trained in this. Because the only way for the future is if every single training had to include this. Because the small number of places that focus on this, the rape crisis centres, they're all with heavy loads. And yeah, we need to get the main trainings to take this on. I agree absolutely with what Amanda just said. If you are a survivor and you go to a therapy organisation like 1 in 4, where you know your therapist will be a survivor, you've chosen that from the start. And it may be the brilliant DID therapists that there are will at some point join together in an organisation, and people going would know that. But outside of that, it would take years and deep knowledge to not be dumping something on a client or patient. Tricky one.
Yes.
There was one email that really worried me on the chat line. Someone that feels they don't matter at all and that nothing they do matter. And that level of depression and not being seen is just awful. And however ludicrous it sounds to people you don't know, but the 4 of us listening here that read that, that is shocking. That goes into us, that you do matter, even if you've got no spark in you at the moment, and even if you don't get a spark tomorrow, even if you are understandably depressed and feel useless and worthless after all you've gone through. That is all part of the toxicity of what you've had to breathe in. And it's precisely that we're all united against trying to fire the mind against that.
Thank you, Valerie. Yes, some of the questions that people have sent to us indicate how very distressed and alone some people feel with their situation, and it's.
Can I just come in there, Alf?
Yes, please do.
Because I've read some of those comments, and you know, I know how I feel, how we feel every day, when we're dealing with the daily challenges with parts of us having high anxiety levels, flashbacks, night terrors, all manner of dissociative experiences, depression, suicidal ideation, all of those sorts of things. And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here this evening. And so any of you that is listening, I'm not a therapist. I'm obviously got my own challenges that I'm managing. And I am fortunate to have been able to resource my therapy from my savings. All I would say is keep coming to the forums, any online forums that you find helpful with the survivor community. You know, reach out to me with direct messaging just to kind of let you know that you know, that I'm here. You know, I can't be of practical help, but to my mind, when I first knew that even somebody understood what my experiences were, that lifted just a tiny you know, bit of my distress.
Yeah.
So you know, hear me. I hope you can feel that I'm with you as much as I can be, as much as we can be.
Yeah, and can I just add a little caveat to that, Amanda? The thing that hasn't been mentioned tonight, and it's the word stigma, and I think that that's massively important when we think about DID and it being a hidden condition, because not only are we saying tonight that therapists, medics, and a whole lot of other mental health professionals are lacking training, awareness, and knowledge about the condition. And it's been hidden because of the lack of training. From the point of view of somebody with DID, there's a huge sense in which stigma keeps DID people from letting others know about it. And so it becomes a case of people with DID hiding their condition, hiding their behavior, hiding, you know, the times when they feel they need to switch or want to have a different part coming out. And so it's like chicken and egg situation in a way, until the world understands more about DID, and that's Joe blogs as well as professionals, until the world understands why DID has come into being and understand what it's about. And until the world can be more empathic and understanding about it, then people with DID will continue to keep their condition hidden out of shame and embarrassment.
Absolutely, in terms of stigma, and you're right, Jill, in that there will be, you know, it's taken me 5 years in England for me to, and a very, very, very long battle. And at the end of the 5-year period, I am now in receipt of some support from the National Health Service. But you're absolutely right, is that this is why these sorts of events are important, in that if there's more awareness, and we all know that often stigma comes from a position of people being frightened. You know, they'll be frightened by what they might see when people switch. Those people that are unable to get therapy, if they know that when they go out into the street and they're distressed, or they switch, or they talk about their background and their history, and they're not shamed for actually saying, I have childhood trauma, I have dissociative identity disorder, then yes, of course, therapy is so important, but so is the support and the acceptance and the kindness of humanity, which is exactly the reason why we're here tonight.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, couldn't agree more.
And some of the online resources that people can access, we're listing, aren't we, Valerie?
Yeah.
That's going to come, just help me out here, that's going to come in an email that Jamie's, our technical person, is going to send at the end of tonight, or it's already out there? I can't remember.
We'll circulate it after the event.
Sorry, say it again.
We'll circulate that after the event.
Lovely, that's coming after the event. Thank you. So that will be something that people will have as a resource. We've just got a few minutes left. I wonder if, to finish off, if each of you would give us something that you would really like, just something that you would really like our audience, particular thing that the audience would take away with them from tonight's meeting. Who would like to start? Who would like to go? Jill, will you start?
Yeah, I don't mind. I think I've sort of said it already, really. And that is that 10 years ago, my dream was that the story of Vivian would end up, you know, as a book, so that people could read it and more people could be aware of DID, what it looks like, what little parts are, and so on. And so, but now the book is here, and what is the continuation of my dream? And that is exactly what I've just been saying, that people will continue to talk about DID. People will continue to be curious about it, and eventually to find a place where the majority of people know what DID is and have a heart and a mind that can be supportive of anybody who has the misfortune to have had traumatized childhoods which have led them to have this condition called DID.
Thank you, Jill. Valerie, would you like to give us your takeaway?
Yeah, but DID is not a disorder. The disorder is in the society and the individuals that hurt the child. DID is a creative defense from a brave child, and that it is attachment seeking, not attention seeking.
Lovely. And that recognizes, isn't it, that people need to be cared for and understood, and to be able to depend on others who can stay with them and believe in them and allow them to grow. Lovely. Amanda, would you, what would you like
Yes, yeah,
to
thank
take
you.
away?
What one thing to say about the attachment is that also for people to not always assume that, you know, whilst it is the vast majority of cases that it is always abuse, because sometimes that can lead to people not talking about it. And so, you know, we haven't talked tonight about some of the perhaps more less common forms of trauma, such as medical trauma, where people may have that disorganized attachment, or sorry, insecure attachment from you know, from medical trauma. But yeah, there's a couple of things from me. Is one, the word curious. I like the word curious. I always have. One is about being curious about yourself, and doing your own learning in terms of understanding how your mind works, how emotions work, both for your own well-being, and so that you can better support those people with DID who might then have to manage the more extreme. So understand, just learn about your brain, understand your limbic system, understand your autonomic nervous system, understand how to sort of calm yourself in your emotions. So that's kind of one thing, is for everybody to have the curiosity about themselves, and therefore then they're better able to support others. And the other one then is for children, is that we can look at how we might support and treat and manage people who already have developed a dissociative disorder. But the other one is to look for those little signal symptoms, those little red flags. It won't always be a child that's misbehaving. It will often be the coper. It will often be the one in the corner that everyone's praising for being brave about something that they've experienced. So the importance of really, you know, childhood dissociative symptoms, being aware, or just being curious. You see a child, you know that something's happened in their world, or maybe you don't, and you just ask a few questions, because that little kid may be looking as if they're coping, but they're, you know, internally they're developing this creative strategy, which later in life will catch up with them, as it has done with me.
Yes, yes. And having an adult who will take the time to ask and to show that they really want to understand can make a huge difference. That's the end of our evening. Thank you all very much for joining us, and for all the questions. As we said, there will be some resources that appear in an email that follows this, and we wish you well, and we may continue this conversation in some way in the future. Thank you for coming, and all the best. Good night.